So let's see. So here's what we're gonna. Today we're talking about buffer overflows, but I want to show you sort of how this fits into everything else. And maybe we can do a quick poll of the room. Let's see. How many? Let's see. What's a good way to do this? How many people have worked on pwnable challenges in a CTF before? Okay. And how many people have worked on maybe some kind of like used GDB in the past? Okay, cool. And what about pwn tools? Have you used pwnlib in Python? Okay, so great. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to we're basically going to solve a bunch of challenges together using pwn tools, and that's going to involve some work with GDB. And all of these challenges are related to buffer overflow vulnerabilities. They are in 32-bit Linux binaries. So that's all very specific, and therefore I wanted to give you a sense of why that matters, in the bigger context. So if you're kind of learning pwning challenges and getting better at these, then there's a couple of sort of different skills you want to learn. First, usually we start with buffer overflows, and that's because that gives you a sense of the setup of the stack and overriding return addresses and getting control of the instruction pointer in a running binary. So that's important. After that, we usually talk about, well, the rest of these can kind of go in any order. But often we hit on format string vulnerabilities, which basically lets you do an arbitrary read or an arbitrary write. I'm going to stand up because I'm kind of invisible while I'm seated. So we do format string vulnerabilities, and then we talk about, well, what if you can't execute your own code, if you can't just sort of put it on the stack and then run it? Well, then it's important to be able to jump to code that's already in the program. And there are ways to do this. The global offset table is a part of a binary that contains pointers to functions that are already going to be called. And so if you can overwrite that spot, then you can say, instead of calling print, you can call system and then get shell. So that's a skill that is very important to learn. Next, well, I'll skip down to shellcode. Of course, it's important if you have the ability to execute shellcode, it's important to know how to write it. And so usually shellcode problems start with something simple like going to a website and pulling some pre-written shellcode. For example, Shellstorm is one that's got just a ton of shellcode available. And then you can do that. So that's awesome. It's a lot of fun. I think part of the challenge there is often if you're working for like a different platform, like it can be a little bit more challenging to write like shellcode for MIPS or for ARM, where you have different assumptions about, well, there are different registers and opcodes and so on. So it can be kind of interesting. Then return-oriented programming is a very important and common tool or approach. And what that means is basically, let's say that you can't run your own shellcode. Well, then it's important to, sometimes you can still generate a shell by sort of jumping to different sections of the running executable and just running, like executing one or two instructions and then returning again, and then basically constantly jumping to little, one or two instructions at a time, pieces of the code, and then stitching together your own instructions to do whatever you want to. So that's pretty cool, and that's called return-oriented programming. And a chain of such return, basically pointers to other parts of the code, is called a ROP chain. And so there's software out there that lets you generate a ROP chain and sort of stitch together code to do what you would like to. So pretty interesting stuff. And then finally, the heap, well, second to last, the heap. That's an important class of problems where, let's say that you don't have, there isn't anything vulnerable on the stack, but you have something like incorrect calls to allocate memory. So for example, some memory gets freed twice in a row by accident, and that was a programming mistake. Well, in that case, you can actually take advantage of that and do some pretty terrible things. So you can generate, arbitrate your own, execute your own arbitrary code, all kinds of things. So there are things called heap overflows. There's double freeze. There's there are these things where if you just get an off by one write, so you can write one more byte, then you can do things like change the size of the next little chunk of allocated memory in a way that lets you then write into other memory. So it can get kind of complicated, and it's really interesting. So that's heap exploitation. And then finally, there are some sort of security protections that are often placed on binaries. For example, Pi stands for position independent execution. We talked briefly about that last week. That's the idea that you can have some code that is basically to try to prevent somebody from being able to jump to specific locations and then execute code. That code is placed in random locations in memory. And so there's a challenge about how do you get around that in order to still be able to carry out an exploit. And then Railroad is similar. I talked about overriding this global offset table. Well, there's a protection that can make this read-only. So this stands for relocation read-only. So if that's set up, then there are also other ways that you can nonetheless write to places that let you execute code. So kind of fun. So these are all different techniques. I just wanted to give you a kind of a big picture because we're going to zoom in and just do buffer overflows, and it's important to know, okay, where does this fit in? So there's of course different architectures. Today we're doing Linux x86, and then there are this is just a couple of them. And then if you're looking for some useful references. I found this book by John Erickson to be really, really good. Despite its being a little bit dated now, I mean, the book comes with a CD, and so you can take the CD and it has all of his code, and you can work on practice problems and step through his examples in the book. The book itself shows you like screenshots from GDB. So that you can actually, as you're reading the book, you can see exactly what you would be seeing if you were running, working along with him. So he goes into basic buffer overflow exploits. He has an excellent chapter on format string vulnerabilities, and I highly recommend it. And this is a newer book. I haven't gone into it much yet, but it looks like from the content that it's very sound. And then this is a very good reversing book. So just some, potentially useful resources. And then there are some other, CTF problems we can that you can look at later. Maybe I'll come back to this at the end of the talk. Okay. Any questions so far? Is this all like material you would like to see? Is there anything you're like, oh man, I wish Richard were covering this? Okay. So we have for today. Let's see if we've got this populated yet. We've got a CTFD instance, and I can talk through some of these problems if we don't have them live, but of course it'd be great if we do. How are we doing, Jaime?
It's up. There's DNS issues.
Okay.
In like 2 minutes it might be up.
Okay. Well, you might try this site, and maybe you're ahead of my browser's cache or something. I tried. It's not that.
It's the router that we're all connected to right now.
Okay.
Like NYU router.
The router needs to refresh, basically, and we're waiting for the router. Okay. All right. Well, then I will go into my virtual machine here. Okay, and let me just show you some problems here. I've got sort of a little bit of an instruction sheet. I've got some. Okay. Let's see. This is the Git site. So we have 4 challenges for today, and basically 3 of them are simple and 1 of them is harder. So if you have already some experience doing pwning, then feel free to work on the harder one. So you're not going to feel like this is boring. And then if this is new, then we've got challenges for you too. So let's see, exploitation. Okay, so we got 4 buffer overflow problems.
Should we have done this from the Git?
We've got a CTFD instance that's being spun up. Well, that's up right now and is refreshing.
All right, so we don't need to download anything right now.
That's right. You don't need to download anything. So for now, I'm just going to talk through a couple of these. So here's the first one, and this one is guaranteed the simplest buffer overflow problem you will ever see. Here is the C code, and let's see, is that big? I'm trying to make this visible on one page. Okay, is that visible? Can you read this, or do you need me to zoom in some more? Bigger? Okay. So here's main, and let's see, can I get vuln too? Okay. So can somebody who was here last week tell us what the vulnerability is in this code? Take a look at it, take a minute or two.
Is it the fgets?
Get.
We have called it gets up here, right?
Yeah.
You can access the challenge from here,
Oh.
this IP address.
Awesome.
It's going to give you,
We have it shortened. It's osiris.link/wordings.
is that going to work?
Yeah, it's pointing to the IP.
So let's try that.
/wordings.
It's going to give you an SSL error. Just like click past it.
Uh-huh.
Click advance and then accept the risk.
Okay.
We sorted this out, but NYU's DNS, you can blame them. Yeah.
Got it.
So you're gonna have to register an account.
Okay. Yeah, so we should have some challenges here. We gotta log in first. Okay. I think for these, I'm gonna give it a. Feel free to give whatever throwaway email you'd like, and
You're
then
not gonna get any emails
yeah.
for confirmation.
and then a fake password.
Will you get a confirmation?
No.
Oh.
Unless you turn that on. You're supposed to make some noise looking.
Okay, so once you register, you will have access to the challenges, and as you can see, there's no email validation or anything. And then, cool. So this gives you the vulnerable code.
Do you want us to upload the actual C code
Yes.
as well?
Can we please put on the source code? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want the source code for all the challenges?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. This is meant to be. This is not meant to be super difficult. It's meant to be find the vulnerability by reading the source code. So if you download this vulnerability, then you'll get basically what I've already got here. And the first thing I'm going to do just to show you this, there's almost always you do 2 things. At least I do it when I'm starting a vulnerable. The first thing I'll do is I'll run file on the vulnerability. And what is this telling us?
So it still has debugging codes, right?
Yep, that's right. And we also can see it's a Linux file, right? It's a 30-bit application. So that's going to tell us something about the architecture and about how the stack is going to be set up. It means that arguments will be pushed onto the stack instead of passed via registers. And so that's useful to know. It helps us to kind of read the code and figure out how we're going to do an exploit. The second thing I'd like to show you is this tool called checksec. And there's a link I've got here for where you can download it. It's right here. I think in some Linux instances, like Kali Linux, I think this is already available to you. If not, you can come over here, and this guy has this tool. Let me show you how it works. basically, I'm going to go into my own instance. Okay, I just called checksec and give it a file, and in this case, the vulnerable file. And this tells us some things about the security protections on the file. Let's see. I'll do that again. Okay. So I'll move that up a bit. So we can see that this partial relo thing means that the global offset table is writable. The stack canary here means that there's no canary on the stack, and maybe can somebody tell us what a canary is and how it works?
Is a canary something that stops you from accessing memory past a certain point, or like at least tells you when you reports whenever memory past a certain point is accessed?
Yeah, that's pretty much the idea. Basically, on the stack, as soon as you call a function, at the very top, between the code that's written to the stack for a function and the return address for that function, this canary gets placed. And what happens is at the very beginning of the function, the canary is written, and at the very end, before returning, there's a check that's made that the value of that canary is the same thing as that something that's held in sort of this special register that is otherwise not accessible to to the user or to an attacker. And so if those two values are the same, then the code continues to execute. If not, there's a seg fault and everything dies. And so the idea is the canary is sort of like the canary in the coal mine. It's saying, hey, something's wrong with the stack, it's been corrupted. We shouldn't go any further because this might be an attacker trying to get shell. So that's the idea. Okay, so there's no canary, so that's useful for us. The NX bit is saying, is the stack executable? And in this case, it's enabled, which means we can't run code that's on the stack. This is saying there's no position independent execution, and then the rest of it, it's not so important. Actually, I haven't seen this show up a lot in Ponables yet, so actually I'm not sure what those two are. Yeah, but anyway.
Richard.
Yeah, starting?
Thank you.
Oh, hello.
No, I just needed to restart.
Richard?
Yes.
The data is propagated, so the proper link is now working.
Great.
And the source code is uploaded as well.
Thank you very much. Okay.
And if the site isn't working, just do a Control-Shift-R, which will refresh your cache.
Right. Okay. So
Doesn't work. Doesn't work? Nope.
let's see. NYU.cool.
Anybody doesn't buy their domains. That's what I do.
That should be a catchphrase. Okay.
Do you have .biz yet?
No,
Dude.
No.
singles.
Just so you know, all of my challenges are worth 1 point. Okay, so
It's
here
on
we've got,
cheap,
yeah,
though.
so we've got the C code and we've got the vulnerable application, so you can download that. And so we were looking at the C code here, and the vulnerable function here is, which one?
Yes, it's gets, not fgets.
It's gets, right. And of course if you man gets, it will immediately tell you, never use this function, like, up front. And yeah, so pretty much that's the vulnerability. We used gets. If you use gets, basically, you're really asking for trouble. And so this function's asking for trouble. But not only is it asking for trouble, it's very nice. Basically, if you do anything that seg faults, this seg fault handler gets called, and it will print the flag. So really, all we need to do is run this code and get it to seg fault. So that is why this is a simple buffer overflow. Let's see. So so the point of this challenge, okay? Let's take a look at what actually we can overflow here. We've got a string that's getting written, when we call this vulnerable function, we read into a buffer of length 16 characters. and then there's probably some other stuff on the stack, and then there's the return address. So how can we cause this to crash?
Well, by overriding the return address.
Mm-hmm. So how many bytes do you think we should put in there? 40,000. Yeah, let's try 40,000 bytes, and I'm gonna type them one at a time. So let's see. Get out of there and come over here. Okay, so let's just if I run vuln, then we have to enter a string, and so if I enter like 8 bytes or something, 10, 5, then nothing happens. And now let's try entering 40,000. That's about 40,000, and boom, we get a flag. So there's the first flag. So the point of this challenge is really not to be like, oh man, we solved a buffer overflow. But what we're going to do now is we're going to solve this remotely, and we're going to use pwnlib. So this is to teach everybody how to use pwnlib. So one thing you can do is just netcat. What is the address? Hacknight.nyu.cool. So this will give us the same problem, and we can do the same thing. Okay. So that's a nice little sanity check. But now we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to do it with a script. And this will help us for later. So pwntools is available right here at this link. It works with Python 2, and as of like about a month ago, it works with Python 3. So what I'm going to do tonight is teach the interface with Python 2, but it's basically the same thing. I used it with Python 3 effectively almost like a year ago, so I think they just made a couple of changes so that like some of the ways that they're getting bytes back from a server are handled a little bit more cleanly. I haven't gone and tested that yet. So today I'm just going to run everything in Python 2, but essentially the good news is that probably for good practice you can go ahead and work with the Python 3 version, and it should be pretty stable. So let's create, and you can sort of work along with this, let's create a new script here, and I'm gonna import everything from pwn. This is with pwnlib already installed. And I'm just going to save this and come over here and round 2. Okay. And so the first thing I'm going to do is specify if I'm working locally or remotely. So, and then I'm going to set up a process. So p equals process, and then I'm going to specify the location of it. So for me, that's going to be here. For you, it's going to probably be somewhere else. And okay. Okay. So this is the location of my vulnerable application. And then otherwise, the way you tell pwnlib to connect to a remote server, basically use netcat. You just do remote, and then you need the location. So for us, that's this. No, this host. And then you give the port. Third little piece here. Is everybody with me so far? Okay. Third piece is in order to get an interactive script so that this is just running in the terminal, you type p.interactive and call that as a function. And so with that, we should have a basic script to run this. So let's see, I've specified local is true, so this should be running my local vulnerable function. And then, was it round 2 I called it? Yeah. So if I called this, then I should get the vulnerable function. And here it is. So you can see we get a little log statement here that it's switching to interactive, and it started this process. And then, so that just makes, so you can check that and make sure you know what executable you're running. And then I get to enter my string, and I can do it, and it gives me a flag. Okay, so that's a good check. And then let's, as another check, this is what I usually do at the start of a problem. Just make sure, like as a sanity check, that the executable is actually running somewhere, and that eventually we will be able to get a flag. Like, do that first. Don't solve the challenge and then wonder if like you can actually access it. Just do this first. Okay, great. So we can do the same thing and the same flag. Okay, so that's a brief intro to how you set this up. I'll show you a couple other things. Let's send programmatically to the server some bytes. So let's say we want to okay. Yeah. So first I'm going to receive until I get to a particular string, because I know it tells me string. So I'll just receive until that. And then I'm going to send a bunch of A's, like 40 of them. And then a new line at the end. Alternatively, I could do send line, like that, and those do the same thing. Can you see that? Just commented out, a little gray.
Hey Richard.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's worth noting that if you're on a 64-bit architecture, you're going to need to install the 32-bit multi-arch libs to be able to execute this binary.
Do I have that here?
Or recompile it yourself.
That's right. And let me show you the Docker container so you can see that. So you may need to run this command right here in order to be able to run a 32-bit binary on a 64-bit machine. Is that big enough? Can you see that? So you would do sudo apt-get install y gcc multilib. Yep. Another thing is I have, and Jaime, maybe if we could, it would be nice to have these available along with the challenges.
Sure. What files do you want uploaded then? The instructions, source code, anything else?
And the vulnerable application, yeah. The instructions are just useful. So what this is doing, this is just telling you if you wanted to take the C code and compile it yourself into a vulnerable binary, these are the instructions you would use. And that just creates the same challenge that you're seeing. So yeah, that's just for your information. All right, so back to the back to this.
Can you show that again, the compile string?
Oh yeah, of course. And we're going to have the compilation instructions for every problem up on the challenges, along with the challenges too. So let me go ahead and that'll still be there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this again, and we should be able to exploit round 2. Okay, so what this does, as you can see, we didn't see the initial part, please enter your string. That was read by pwnlib. Then we sent the bytes, and then we switched back to interactive. And so the output gets sent back to us like this. And another useful thing you can do is when you run a Python script, you can type debug. This is important. You can type debug right at the back. And then you'll actually be able to see the specific bytes you get. And so you can see that before, like when pwnlib was still running and not interactive, it received this information. And so like you can see the new line character here, that was not not a printable character, but with debug you can tell, oh, I'm receiving these non-printable characters from the server. Sometimes that's useful. And then we can see, yes, I spent 41 bytes, so that's 40 A's plus a new line, and then I got these bytes back. And that's all visible, and so debug is a very useful feature here. Okay, so that's challenge 1. How are we doing? How are you guys going with the script? Would you like some more time to like produce this yourself? Would you, like, I can totally...
Couple more minutes, yeah.
Okay.
Right, sorry about that, Richard, all the files are upset.
Oh yeah, don't apologize. I didn't actually tell you. Jaime, could you please put the compilation instructions
I
on?
forgot to upload the whole.
Oh, yeah, sure. So let's take a look at the source code for the next challenge. I would say, Wolfgang, if you'd like to compile these locally.
No, I got it running.
Oh, you got it?
Brought somebody else.
Okay, great. Cool. Okay, so let's take a look. So wait, that was the exploit. Let's look at buffer overflow 1. Here's the vulnerable code. Let's see here. Well, let's take a minute, take a look at the code, and then maybe somebody can tell us how this works and suggest a way to exploit it. So I'll give you guys just a minute to, download the code and take a look at the C code.
Is there a Git repo we can go to, or do we have to download it?
Oh yes, go to the. We do have we first put these on a private Git repo. So the best way to get the C code is by downloading it from here. So
I could put. Do you mind if we put the Docker stuff up in Hackney?
not at all. Like, there's nothing here that is private in any way. Like, this is all like for everybody's learning.
Are we allowed to redistribute Pico stuff?
Now that's a question, actually.
Just check the copyright on Pico.
Yeah. So I will say, like, and the flag was thank you Pico. Like we're citing this. These are challenges from Pico CTF 2018. Generally, I think the way that they do this, they ask that. Well, there are certainly write-ups online about how to solve the challenges. So I think they just ask that they're cited, basically, if people use these challenges. You know, if you're going to pass this along, just tell people this is CMU's set of challenges from 2018. Okay, so let's take a look at vulnc, and then we've got compilation instructions again, and then the vulnerable app, or vulnerable executable. So, any ideas about sort of where the vulnerability is? So, or more to the point, what is this program doing? We start by running main. There's some sort of instructions here. They are not so important. Really what matters is here and what happens in vuln. So what is this? What's it do? If we're not clear, one thing we can do is run it.
It's taking a string, right?
Yeah. Whoops. It certainly does. And like here, it certainly asks for a string. And then it does something. And well, it exits. And so it runs vuln. And in vuln it takes...
Oh, okay. Well, there was more to it.
No, here it gets the buffer, and then basically that's it.
So here you're trying to rewrite the return address to call the win function?
That's right, that's right.
What's that?
That's a good question. Maybe, Yash, how does this work?
So like here, as we know that we are taking the string as an input, we are trying to actually call the win function to get the flag. And so we are overriding the buffer to change the return address of the one function to call the win function.
So we've been looking at the stack in previous workshops. So basically, what's going to happen is we have a return address that's been pushed onto the stack. Above the return address, if there are any arguments, they're going to be stored up here. That's if there are any. The function vulnerable doesn't have any arguments. We have the old base pointer. And then down here we have things that have been stored onto the stack for use of the function. So we have a buffer, which is 16 bytes long. So that's going to be 4, 8, 12, 16. So like this. Really, that's a 3. And so on. It is 16, right? So it's like 13 to 16 here. 8 to 11, 12 to 15. Yeah. Okay. Right, so we have basically buffer here, and then we're going to overwrite it. So we're going to start by putting some A's in, or whatever we want, and they will gradually fill up and overwrite. And so Yash is saying that we can put 4 bytes, overwrite the return address, and then when we're finished, when the function is finished, it will jump. What I'd like to show you first is we want to know where we're going to go, the address of win. So I'm going to do that by just calling GDB. Can you see that? That's kind of a little low, but GDB on the vulnerable function. And so here we are in GDB. Let's see, maybe I should move this up a bit. Okay. Okay. I can't zoom in. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here we are in GDB. So I'll type a couple of commands that are useful. Info functions. And that gives us all the defined functions that are here. And so right here we can see win. And there's the address. So, okay, that's useful. Let's save that information. So I've got here an exploit again, and I'm just going to record that win address right there. Now, the next thing we need to do is figure out how many A's we need to put onto this stack. So let's figure out where the gets call is actually going to be located. So I'm going to type disassemble vuln. Was that too fast?
A little bit.
Yeah, that's the command. Disassemble vuln. Okay, so I figured out the name. We know it from the source code, but if you didn't have the source code, you would still be able to type info functions and then learn this way. And here it is. Now this is in Intel syntax. In AT&T syntax, right? So I'm going to set the disassembly flavor to Intel. And if I don't have any typos, okay. Now if I do the same thing, you can see this is in Intel syntax. So you can do that to kind of view your assembly however you'd like to. Key point is that we can see right here is the call to get. So let's get GDB to put a breakpoint right here, so that before we read in our bytes, we can look at the stack, and immediately afterwards we can look at the stack again, and then we can figure out how many bytes we need to put where. So to do this, here's how you do it. Instead of calling process, remember we're doing all this locally. I'm going to use this command called gdb.attach. gdb.debug. There are two commands that you'll use all the time. The first is called debug, and the second is called attach. What debug does is it says, as soon as a function is called, as an executable is begun, attach GDB to it. And like from the very first instruction, have GDB there. And then you can have GDB already run a script that says like put a breakpoint on a specific spot. So if a function occurs very early in the code, you can nonetheless have GDB break on it. So that can be very useful. What GDB attach does is it says take a process that's already running and then attach GDB to it. So like if it has stopped to wait for your input, for example, or maybe you're running pwnlib and you put it to sleep for a bit in order to allow this, really if the executable has to wait for some reason, then this can be useful. You can attach GDB to a running process. I find that if I'm a little bit concerned about what the environment is going to be, attach might be a little better than debug. Because if GDB is already attached at the very beginning, sometimes that can change some of the things that are at the very top. Can you confirm that, Kyle? Like, have you seen that also? Because I certainly have.
GDB does its darndest to make sure that everything is the same every time.
Okay.
When you run it under GDB.
Okay, well that's good. So anyway, yeah, so in this case we're going to use debug for sure because we need to put break on something very early. So same thing, I'm going to give it the process location. Okay, and now I'm going to give it as my second parameter a string containing the commands that I'm going to pass to GDB. So let's see, I'm going to do break on 6A9 and then continue. And that should put a call, a breakpoint at exactly that call to get. And of course, I'll comment out this earlier line. And so if that has worked, then when we call interactive, we should see GDB break. Now, this is very important. In order for this to work, actually, let me first run this without doing this. Hopefully, I should fail in a way that will be instructive. That didn't fail. Let's see. Oh, I think I know why. Oh, okay. So I already have set a particular value to allow me to attach. I want to show you that location. Let's see, is that here? Yeah. So it's this specific value. In Linux, this is a byte that allows you to attach GDB to a process. You have to set it. You have to set it from 1 to 0. So in this case, I'm not sure why that actually worked. Oh, I haven't. Oh no, it didn't work.
You're on the remote.
Oh, I'm on the remote. Yeah, you're right. I'm not local. That's why. All right. Let's try that again. So, yeah, that worked. Well,
Go back to your script real quick.
yeah. Okay, so this is what it looks like, and this is working properly. What I'm confused about is it shouldn't be working, but basically, I found that, yeah, you need to set a bit to 0, and that is with this command over here, right here, in order for a GDB to, for a ptrace to be enabled, in order for GDB to attach to an executable. So maybe the GDB.attach doesn't require it. I certainly know when you use GDB flag P to attach to a running binary, that's definitely necessary, that you've allowed ptrace. So anyway, just so you know, you may need to change that flag from a 1 to a 0 in order to attach GDB to a process. Okay, so let's see. Here, we've now run this, and you see in a different window, we've got a breakpoint, and just to see where we are, I'm going to type disassemble, and you can see we've stopped right at this call to get. So let me, I'm going to take a look at the stack right here. So I'm going to say examine 40xw says basically 40 hexadecimal words. A word is 4 bytes. So I'm saying print me 40 of these 4-byte segments starting at ESP, the stack pointer. And so this will print me a bunch of things on the stack. And now we want to enter a string. So if I just do NI for next instruction, now this executable is going to allow me to type a bunch of A's or something. Really should have put this in automatically, but I'll just type 16 characters. And now we're at the next instruction, and we can look at the stack again. And you can see up here a bunch of ASCII A's. So if OX41 is a capital A. And the more you do this, the more it will be obvious, when you're looking at the stack and you see a bunch of these ASCII values. Now let me type where, and that tells me what instruction I'm at in Vuln, but it also tells me what is the next instruction in main that will execute once I return. And the way this is, how do we know what that is, by the way? Yes, Brian.
Look at the register that contains the return address.
You would look at the return address, correct. Now, if you're in an architecture where that's stored in a register, yes, that's right. But actually, this is looking at the stack to get that.
Right.
Yeah. So we can do the same thing. Let's take a look at the stack. And if you're looking carefully, you can see here is the return address. So this is good news. It means now we can count. And we can say, okay, how close are we to that? Well, these are 4-byte segments, so this is 16 more bytes up here, and then we've got another 12, and then we've got the return address. Okay, so before we forget that, and I entered, what was it, 16, right? So we've got, if I did the math, that's 44 bytes, 16 plus 16 plus 12. So to break this, let's see, this is the second one. I'll send 44 A's, and that should get us right up to the return address. And now, let's add the return address. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to input the return address? Any ideas? Like as a string?
Oh,
Or, yeah.
anything about that?
Okay. So remember, we want this to be visible as an integer, and we have to deal with the fact that we've got endianness. We have this is a little endian machine, right? So what's let me put it this way. We've got previously we had a buffer of size 16, and we start. If we are, let's say I have A, B, C, D, then the lowest address is going to be right here. And then, so we would write an A there. And then we go up one and we write a B, C, D, and so on. So as we're going up, we're filling our way upwards. So when we get up here, now note that if we actually look at an integer, it's going to be stored as little endian. So if we have like 0x, I don't know, 08, 04, 85 CD or something, then this byte, the CD, is going to be right here. So that's going to be a like that. Which means that if we wanted to write a string into here, we would have to go backwards. So we would have something like CD 85 04 08. Make sense? And so that's going to fill this up in the proper way such that when the processor then looks at this location, it's going to read it as an int and it will read out this int. So I'll show you two ways, therefore, that you can enter an address. And they're going to do the same thing. So I'll call this payload, A times 44. And now I'm going to add to it this win address, except backwards. So I'll start with a hexadecimal 16, and another hexadecimal 86, and another one 04, and another one 08. Okay? Alternatively, we could ask Pwnlib to do this for us, so that we don't have to constantly be like parsing integers backwards in our brains as we're working on an exploit. That's just really error prone. It's important to know how to do this, but it's also error prone. So another thing we can do, P32 says take an integer and pack it as take a 32-bit integer and pack it as a string. So I can just do this. That's the same thing. These two functions are doing the same. And just to show you, let's send that, because there's actually, I'll put a little, why not, something like that. And then I'll just send the payload along with the new line. And so what this is going to do is, we're still in debug mode, so we're going to break right before we send the payload, and then we'll execute the payload and we'll look at the stack. So here we go. I'll quit out of this, and let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so we are breaking some breaking at gets, and again, if you want to, you can do that. And so let's take a look at where we are. These are the same instructions as before, I'm just doing a little faster. And then we are at, so this is our return address. And so keep an eye on it. In fact, what's that? D6297C? Did I, yeah. Okay, so there's our return address. Now I'm going to step one step and send the payload. So let's see if we can see that. So here's our payload, and you can see right here is that win address. And just to show you that we actually did that overwrite, you can see the C's following. And then here's the same address. So, you know, no magic. Sending in the string and sending in the P32 did the same thing. So you can see that. And then, so at this point, if I type where, you can see that the return address, instead of 8732, we're now going to jump to 8616. And if we want to, we can, you know, keep stepping forward. So now this is the leave instruction we're at, and this is the return instruction. And so at this point, like if I looked at ESP, it should be, yep. So the stack pointer at this point is pointing to the return address, and one more instruction and we're in win. And then we can continue, and this will break and then you can see the flag. I have a question. When we, actually, any questions so far on this? Yes,
How
yes.
did you find the address which you examined to find the return address? That
Yes.
was 48616.
Your question was, how do you know where the return address is on the stack?
So you typed in X, then something like 0xFF, something like that.
Oh, yes, I could do that too. So earlier, I typed this, right?
Yeah.
Your question was, how do I know what that address is, right? I'm going to scroll up because we're no longer at that same location. But what I did was I looked at the stack pointer, and I said, show me 40 words in hexadecimal starting at the stack pointer. And I knew that the return address was, well, actually earlier, I knew the return address was this because I typed where. And then I could look at the stack and see it. So the question is, how do I know that that address is that number that I typed in? It's over here on the left. So these are addresses, and we're going up 16 bytes at a time. So I just count over 4, 8, 12, and so it's FFD6297C because I've added 12. And so that's why I know that this number starts with that byte, which is actually over here. So if that specific byte is actually this spot. And so we're going up 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're just printing this information as hexadecimal ints, which is why it's showing up the way it is. Does that make sense? So it's helping you deal with the endianness and make sense of this a little bit. Okay, so that's how we know that, and so I could, once again.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Is there another way to find out what the return address is without where?
Without where?
Backtrace?
Yeah, backtrace, it does the same thing. But that's exactly the same command. There are... another way you could do it if you wanted to, if you had this opened up in a tool like Binary Ninja or in IDA Pro, you could do the same thing we're doing here, and it would.
What does ELT mean? Like when you disassembled the whole code, it showed getas@ELT.
Get
like wherever there is a function call in your whole disassembled code, it shows @ELT.
Oh, at PLT?
Yeah.
Yes, that's. I don't think we're going to go too much into that today. That has to do with the procedure linkage table, which is basically how things are passed, function pointers are put onto the global offset table. And so if there's a libc function that gets called, then yes, then there's a little routine that will get called that loads the libc address onto the global offset table, which is why it's writable, in fact. So that's really a different part of that roadmap when we start getting into overriding function pointers and dealing with the global offset table. So I'm going to hold that, but that's important to know. Okay, so I think that's the second problem. So we're at 7 o'clock. So I'm just going to show you what the last two problems are.
How about we let people do them themselves?
Yeah, that sounds good.
And then Richard and I are here to help you out. So are Jaime and John.
Correct. So I think the point today was to show you how to use these tools. We talked a bit about arguments. This challenge here is the same thing. It's a buffer overflow exploit, except that you need to pass arguments along with returning. And so it's the same idea. Except that when you are overriding the return address, you also need to go further up that stack and put the arguments on the stack where they're supposed to be. And the way you can tell where they're supposed to be, if you're not totally sure, is the same way we were just doing, by going in with GDB and stopping at certain parts of the code and looking and seeing what is the code actually looking for and where. So that's how you solve this one. And then the last one is a bit of a challenge. It's a canary. So basically with the canary, it's the same thing except that right here, below the base pointer, the canary gets written. And this is a number that is unknown to you. For this challenge, it's pulled off of the server. So the canary's on the server, but you have no access to that number. So the question is, how do you figure out what this number is in order to then continue and carry out your overflow? Yes, Jaime?
Why do we need to figure out that number?
Well, if you don't know what that number is, then you would have to guess it. And how many possibilities are there for this canary? Yes.
Why do we need to guess it?
Well, let's say that you just, this was the very beginning of the talk. So if you write over this and it's wrong, then the canary gets checked, and before you can get to this return address, to the return function, the return instruction, then there will be the execution will stop. So you won't get to the flag because essentially the canary was changed. Yeah.
So there's no way to skip it.
That's the question. That's sort of this particular challenge is, you know that the canary is going to be read. What can you try to do in order to solve this? And it's a little bit challenging. And so I know that, well, it's the middle of the quarter. We have tests and exams and homework assignments, but I guarantee you that this is worth it because the flag is a really good pun. So if you get the flag, you will get a really cool joke, and you'll be very happy. So you should work on this problem.
This is something about canaries in a coal mine.
I do not have any further information to provide.
That's the pun. Spoiler alert.
Okay, so that's pretty much. I'd like to kind of leave it open for people to work on problems, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you've got. And please, before you go, fill out a feedback sheet and let us know what you thought, what further problems you'd like to see. That would be awesome. Thank you very much, and I'm going to get some pizza.